Welcome back. Are you sitting comfortably? Earlier on, it was my pleasure to introduce the last panel as the Canada Water Contemporary Theatre Group, resident here in this wonderful art space. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the interactive branch of the Contemporary Dance Troupe. And I just, show of hands, how many people would like us to conduct the discussion through the medium of interpretive dance? Yeah. Good luck with that. Okay. So, hey everyone, I'm John BROOMHALL. Welcome to this WY's session in association with Game Music Connect, in which we're going to aim to cover some key business issues which composers face. And once again, we have a truly illustrious panel dripping with expertise. And we do understand that we're all that stands between you and cocktails, so we'll kind of try and move this along, have some fun along the way. I'm going to start by asking these guys to each introduce themselves and just tell us a bit about your role, your day-to-day activity, and your involvement and interest in music making. And we start with Tom, who needs a microphone. Yeah.
Okay. Does that hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I work at PRS for Music, and I work in the strategy team. And basically, our function is to support negotiations of the biggest deals, so online platforms and broadcasters. But specifically at the moment, I'm working on a project that's trying to address some of the gaps in the licensing coverage in the video games industry. So we're trying to develop license solutions to close some of the gaps that we're observing and some of our members are observing. And our members are composers, music publishers, and songwriters.
Thanks, Tom. Alistair Lindsay.
Yeah, so part of my team in Sony is the music side. So we have in-house composers, we have music supervisors, licensing. So essentially we deal with all aspects of music. We work with composers, agents, everybody, you know, to soundtracks, everything. So, you know, my kind of daily life touches like from PRS to all these guys here, really, and they're similar sort of peers and stuff, so yeah.
Hi, my name's Darrell. I run a company called Cool Music, and we represent some of the finest composers in the world, from Rachel Portman to Daniel Pemberton to Ben Wolfish to lots of others. And we have an interactive side, a gaming side. We have our own orchestra. We have a record company. We have a publishing company. So we kind of span everything, but everything we do is a service to our clients.
Hi, I'm Richard Jakes. I don't need another microphone.
He brought his own.
I'm a composer, primarily for video games. I've been composing for 25 years in the games industry. I also wear another couple of hats. I sit on one of the committees at PRS for Music, advising on video game-related matters, platforms, etc., etc. I also sit on the media committee at BASCA, and my day-to-day role is basically just writing music.
Well, on behalf of myself, on behalf of Audiokinetic and Game Music Connect, a massive thank you to you all for being here. We really appreciate it. We know you're very busy people. And Richard, in particular, thanks to you, because actually I think for me, the genesis of this session this afternoon, from my own point of view, was really an exchange we had earlier in the year where you spoke to me over email very passionately, really, about your feeling that, like, business issues for composers really not being covered very well in games, and there was a need for education. And I know that, well, as you've said, as well as, well, to me, you're an extraordinarily gifted composer yourself, but you also take the time to advocate for these other kind of rights and stuff, and to educate people. So what was on your mind back then when you were saying that, and like today coming to this, what is it that we need to talk about?
I think it's because I've sort of seen the industry grow and develop over quite a long time, and the industry, you know, back in the 90s when I started was still fairly young, and it's still a comparatively young industry now. But historically, in terms of the business side of it, a lot of it stems from sort of software development deals that went on in Silicon Valley in the 80s. So when music started happening in games, there wasn't really any specific kind of set in stone, whether it's contracts or, you know, how does this work, blah, blah, blah. So what I've learned over that period and from dealing with, you know, being involved with PRS and with BASCA and a few other organisations is just really, you know, my passion is to sort of empower people to help join the dots between the business side of the industry, so the decision makers, you know, lawyers, producers, etc., and composers, and especially helping young composers grasp that, I mean, you know, essentially copyright is the legal framework of how a composer makes a living. Not just in games, but across the board. So it's really, you know, my passion to sort of, you know, help join the dots and sort of, you know, share some knowledge and get the industry working together.
Well, whilst I'm thanking people, I also want to thank Simon Ashby, wherever he is, and Noor and Natalie back in Canada, or in China probably at the moment. But yeah, there was a certain amount of poetry, and having had that conversation and been thinking about doing something Game Music Connect-wise, with, you know, on business, and then this opportunity popped up. So thank you for bringing that together, Simon. And let's give them all a very warm WI's welcome. Okay, well, there's a few little sections to move through. First one, I'd love to talk a bit about rights. And just let's cover off some basics. I mean, Tom, can you start us off on just what rights actually exist in a piece of music?
Yeah, I think the best way to start off is by explaining the very basics about copyright law, and I won't go into detail and try not to bore you with it.
Carry
So
on.
in copyright law, you have copyright works, which are things like literary works, musical works, sound recordings, broadcasts, films. And so, for example, a computer game code would be considered a literary work. And you have restricted acts, and these are the things that you cannot do without permission. You cannot do with these copyright works without the permission of the copyright owner. So they're things like broadcast, transmit, reproduce, and perform. As that pertains to music, there are two principal copyrights. There's the composition, so the musical work, and there's the sound recording of that composition. So to give an example, the Beatles, with a little help from my friends, the song is written by Lennon and McCartney, and that's owned by Sony ATV Music Publishing. But the recording as performed by the Beatles is owned by Apple, not the tech Apple, but the Beatles record company, and it's administered by Universal Music. So if there's other cover versions of that song, there's been about 50 at least. So, you know, Wet, 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 that would be, you know, their version would be controlled by Mercury Records, which is part of Universal. And Joe Cocker, his version, A&M Records, part of Universal. So regardless of which recording is used, the composer and the music publisher is always paid. So sound recordings belong to record companies, and they concern the kind of artist performance, and the rights are administered by record companies and also by an organisation called PPL, which is Phonographic Performance Limited, and they collect money from broadcast and some online uses that record companies don't directly administer. The other side of things is the musical work, which is a composition which is controlled by music publishers, and in some cases is administered by PRS for Music and MCPS, which is the Mechanical Copyright Protection Society. That depends on what activity is taking place, and some activities such as a television broadcast or an online stream or a download, those activities basically comprise both acts of reproduction and communication to the public. So both rights, mechanical rights and performing rights, are being exploited at the same time. So the terms mechanical rights refer to, you know, reproduction, copying, and the terms performing rights refer to, you know, performance, be that a stream or a live performance. That's basically it.
Cool.
Is that clear?
Sorry, that rather put me off. That sounded, yeah, didn't sound good, did it? Yeah, so actually, follow-on question from that. How does that work out around the world? Is there a sort of consistency across the board about how these things are dealt with?
I mean, it's broadly the same. So you'd have, a sound recording is largely owned by a record company, or in the case of it's a video game music, it might belong to the games developer or games publisher, and the musical work will belong to, you know, the composer, and they'll assign their rights to a music publisher and a collection society. There are differences around the world in how the administration works and in some important points of law. So, for example, in the US, in a download, it's not deemed that there's a communication or a performance, a communication to the public or a performance taking place. So in the US, in downloads, the idea of performing rights are completely irrelevant. And a download platform, whether that's iTunes or Sony PlayStation, would only need to cover mechanical rights. But in UK and Europe, there's deemed to be a performing right and a communication to the public in the act of a download, which is why PRS is interested in this space.
Alistair,
That's the key difference.
Richard, do you want to enlarge on that at all in terms of how that sort of plays out in terms of how we deal with things in games?
Yeah, just sort of briefly, I mean, from my point of view as a composer, it's really important to just understand the basics. It's not particularly complicated, and as Tom said, basically those two fundamental rights exist. So when you create a piece of music, you automatically own them until you assign them or until you do a publishing deal or et cetera, et cetera. So that's actually your bread and butter, really, when you're negotiating a contract, when someone asks you to do a game, even if it's just a very small mobile game with not a particularly large budget, that is the biggest bargaining chip you have, because, if someone says, oh, we haven't got much money, you say, well, okay, I'll license it to you for a set period of time for a set fee, or you can say, right, well, I'm going to expect something on the back end. I'm going to expect a share of the sales royalties of the game. It's really up to you, but that is the strongest position you have as a creator of music in games, is to remember those rights and use them. They are your rights, and it's up to you how you use them. But really remember that they do belong to you when you create a piece of music, and then it's up to you how you do the deal.
Yeah, so from my kind of point of view, I mean, I'm actually a composer myself as well. I've done a lot of video game stuff as well. So, and having an in-house music team, we can be actually at Sony, we understand the composer's kind of plight sometimes, as you could put it. So, I think hopefully, kind of everybody we've worked with, from people like Rich and we kind of understand all these rights, and obviously there are some business needs, being a platform holder and things like that. It starts to get a little bit, assigning of rights over to the publishing side of Sony, for example. But we make sure, the negotiation is fair, and payment is relative to that. Otherwise, if although say like Rich said, you can do licensing deals and things like that, and in the past we have done things like that, but generally, kind of the point I'm trying to make is we understand, that composers need to make a living, so we make sure it works for both sides, really, and we get what we want, and
I suppose the problem, well, I ask you, do you think there is a problem still that there's just ignorance about all of that with a lot of developers that just expect to pay you a certain amount of money and just without any discussion own everything? And, not necessarily maliciously, right? They just think that that's how it is.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the point is, the reason why the sort of music publishing business exists anyway is because it's a symbiotic relationship between the music publisher and the composer, and it works hand in hand, and it has done for nearly 100 years. I think some game developers and smaller video game publishers, let's say, really have no idea how this works. And I'll put it in very, very simple terms. It works for everyone. So if my music is being, like, say, working with ALASTAIR and Sony, as I have done for many years, the reason why that deal is, in my opinion, the best in the industry is because the compensation you get paid for actually doing the project is very good anyway, but also when that music's used on the game and broadcast, as Tom was saying, via the PlayStation Network, which is deemed as a broadcast in European copyright law, you will also get a sales royalty. But also, your music will always have a life outside of the game. Even if, like, for example, some of Olivia's work, even if it's done very, very interactively, you can still, in a way, repackage it as a more linear thing to be licensed out long after the game has come and gone. We hope games have a long shelf life, but a lot of them don't, but your music could last for many, many years. So the point I'm trying to make is that when your music does last that long, you want to be getting paid, and so does the games company. And this is what they fail to recognise, is that it's in their business interest as well.
Yeah, Tom. Sorry.
And it's also a case that in some instances, the rights just aren't available. So the approach that's been taken historically is for developers to just buy out all the rights that they can in the music in games. But if you're engaging a composer like Richard who's affiliated to a performing right organisation, or if you're licensing a pre-existing track, then in many instances, because of the affiliation of the writers and the way that the copyright law works in Europe, those rights just aren't available to be bought out. So, for example, as a member of PRS, Richard assigns his performing rights to PRS. So Richard isn't in a position to grant a buyout of those rights because they're controlled by PRS. There's a misconception about what's needed, but also what is available. And it's as Richard said, it's this kind of historical way in which these kind of deals have been approached.
So can I just clarify on that? That's very interesting. So even if you, as a composer, sign a contract that basically says, I'm agreeing to buy out, that cannot include your performing right. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if you're a member of PRS
Yes.
and any most European performing rights organisations,
Yeah.
you assign the performing right exclusively to that performing right organisation. It's different in the States, and it's just because they have a slightly different, more competitive system. So ASCAP and BMI are the equivalents to PRS. In the US. There are others, but they have a non-exclusive system. So potentially, if you're a US-based composer, you can do a full buyout of your rights because you have the ability to kind of withdraw those rights from the society. But if they're exclusively assigned to in Europe or in UK, then they're not yours to grant anymore.
I mean, what if the music never gets registered with PRS by the composer, or then it's just out there in the ether, it's just lost?
Not quite. I mean, we would, because we understand the difficulties, and we're trying to, trying to establish licensing frameworks. We're doing a lot of work ourselves, researching, almost kind of creating games cue sheets, and then prompting members to register their works. But that's not ideal. And what should be done is, if you've created some music for a game, and that game is going to be used on a commercial platform, you should register those works and provide as much information as possible to the society. Or if you're published, or you have an agent, or they could do that work for you.
Hmm.
Yeah, just additional comment on that. So I think a majority of developers, as kind of Rich said, would not even know that maybe PRS exists and stuff. So I definitely recommend it's down to the composer to be registering this stuff, and don't rely on the developer or publisher to be actually doing that, because they probably wouldn't even know it exists. And actually, a point as well, just kind of backtracking a bit about rights organisations kind of globally. So over the number of years I worked on games from Japan and the US. So Sony, we kind of do a lot of obviously global collaborations, which means you kind of get involved in all the different organisations, and as Tom said, they all have their quirks, and you can kind of start to get into some complications. I mean, jazz rack in Japan can be quite interesting, especially if you're a UK composer and a PRS member. I've had experience with that this year, and it can be definitely interesting. So, having I think the PRS are great as well for actually giving you some information and advice on that, and I think probably BASCA and organisations like that. So really rely on those to understand the quirks of the other rights organisations as well, if you're working for a developer in another country.
Darrell, have you got anything to add to that? And also, can I ask you what your thoughts are on dealing with soundtrack and then negotiating soundtrack rights, original soundtrack stuff?
Yeah, just listening to Richard, I mean, I'm lucky, or we are lucky, to work with a lot of international companies, Ubisoft, Warner Interactive, and Tencent in China. I think what Richard said, it really echoes with me. A lot of companies, film companies, developers, games developers, that point is so important that a lot of people presume they're buying the rights before a note has been written. And it's very important psychologically for people to understand that the composer creates something and then assigns the rights if he chooses to. And I get, as an agent, a senior agent in the business, there is a sort of almost like a bullying atmosphere sometimes, Now, I don't have a problem with, personally, it's fine for the big companies to own the rights, because a lot of them pay very, very well. And this man on my left, You know, they're a shining example. Not just, if he wasn't here, I would say the same thing. They do, well, I might say something different, but they do. They are a great example, and the fact that he's here shows it all, that he cares, they care, and they're one of the better companies. What rankles me is that some of the other companies, and especially with American film games and Chinese games, is that it's a complete buyout. They don't want to pay any royalties. And what I see on a monthly basis or a weekly basis, it's very hard for our games composers to earn a sustained living. Because as soon as they stop a game, it's like they're unemployed. And that really hurts me emotionally, because their colleagues in the games, the television and the film worlds, they get royalties on everything they play around the world. If you've just written the music for Downton Abbey, you never really have to work again. I mean, that's at the very high end. But the games composers, they suffer because their games finish and that's it. There's no more revenue. And my job as an agent is to explain to these developers and games publishers that, you know, not just what Richard said, that there is a reuse, a secondary market for music, but this great, I feel, is a new development that performance royalties in Europe are being paid, thanks to that man at the very end, and PRS. That's a hope for me. That's a positive light. And that's got to continue, hopefully, in the US, so that I'd love to see them not paid as mechanicals in the US, but paid as a performance revenue to get some royalties flowing. Because, well, again, my last point is a lot of these games developers don't realize that composers don't just turn up and you're hiring me. They are turning up with whole... Whoa. That someone's doing some music for me. That's fantastic. Sound effects. They turn up with hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of studios that someone's got to pay for. Now, traditionally, those royalties pay for my film and TV composers' studios. Now, those games composers rely on their fees to build those studios, and not just build the studios, but keep them up to date with Christian Henson samples every year, as they keep needing more and more money to fund his lavish lifestyle. So, sorry, I love Christian. But it's very important that a flow of royalties, and I see my job to fight for composers when we negotiate. It's fine at the very high end when you're getting a lot of money to pay to write music for a game. But I'd say at least 75% of the time that's not the case. And if we can somehow, if people can understand that the system of royalties needs to be fair, and that is soundtrack royalties as well. And something which I think is a very big positive in the soundtrack world is such a love of games composers and soundtrack composers that there's an excitement when a soundtrack comes out. There isn't that excitement so much when a TV soundtrack comes out. There is when a film soundtrack comes out by the big artists. But that income, and I think the audience love, and they will buy soundtracks. So I try very hard, and my team try very hard to persuade, when we're doing a games contract and negotiate it, can we control who is releasing that soundtrack? If it's Sony, that's fine, because they're great. But if the developer is unknown and they don't know, we will recommend people to release the soundtrack, or we'll release it through our in-house label. But just getting the music out there, letting it go out there and have a life of its own. And you never know, it could get synced to get picked up for a Rolex advert, a David Beckham perfume advert, Victoria Beckham fashion advert, and then there's a whole secondary market of sync licensing and other things, and that's where it gets exciting. So I think that is a positive, but provided we keep the pressure up on the developers to do reasonable deals for composers on those soundtracks. Because, again, sorry, my last point, I've had too many deals recently where they will not even pay the composer any royalties on a soundtrack. That really makes me angry. And that is something which is not acceptable. It's a red line as far as I'm concerned. So if anybody's listening who makes these deals, please listen to this. Pay the composers a reasonable royalty. I'll shut up now.
I just remembered a couple of very quick anecdotes about actually owning your own music, and these actually really, really highlight the point. Probably about 15 or more years ago, I was approached by a sync agent in LA who wanted to license 8 seconds of a piece of music that I'd written for a game for a film trailer. And this lady said to me, you know, this is the clip, 8 seconds long. Sorry, the budget's not very big on this one. It's only $100,000 US. I'm like, oh, okay, what am I going to do? You know. Now, in that instance, the game's publisher and developer owned that music. It was before I was a PRS member, so it was a buyout deal. And of course, I contacted the game's publisher, who I won't mention, and they said, oh yeah, sure, we'll license that music, but we want our name displayed on the screen, and of course, and absolutely ludicrous. So I spoke to the sync agent, and they said, oh, well, we can't do that. And I said, no, but I could write a very similar piece of music that I own. So I did, and I got $100,000, and the game's publisher got nothing.
Brilliant. Tom, do you want to come back in?
Just to say that I think it's really important. I feel really strongly that games developers should start taking the whole business of licensing music and engaging composers more seriously. I've seen lots of agreements where the language used is very vague and a level above any of the specific language you'd expect to see in a music licensing agreement. So there's no reference to any of the specific rights that a composer enjoys. And when you think about the various ways in which music is being used in video games now, and as I said, we've come from a place where you had in-house composers in complete buyouts of works, but it's 2018, and music is used in very interesting ways within video games. So you can't just rely on buyout agreements anymore, and especially if they want to kind of have access to the breadth of music and the breadth of composers that games developers and publishers are seeking. It's just time to take it more seriously.
That is a very good point to draw a line and move on to something I'd now like to talk about.